Thanks, Hugh, and thanks to the board for having me here today. Like was mentioned, we've been working with the board for well over a decade now. And as Hugh mentioned, this is, I think, the third presentation that we're doing to the board on enrollment projections. But we do enrollment projections, I mean, with the exception of maybe a year or two, really on a yearly basis, or at least every 18 months or so, we do an update to the enrollment projection. So we've been doing pretty fairly constant update to the projections, even though you haven't seen me every time that's happened. As Hugh mentioned, really today is not so much that I'm just going to regurgitate what your projections are doing, because I don't think that really paints a complete picture or a fulsome understanding of what enrollment projections are and how we actually devise and come up with enrollment projections. So I think, to be fair, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the context, the environment in which we work with, the different impacts and factors that have an impact or a direct relationship on the numbers that we come up with. I think it's a lot easier to understand enrollment projections when we understand the demographic landscape that we live in, and also an understanding of, we've all heard, and as educators, administrators, I mean, we have lived in the last couple of decades in this environment of declining enrollment. And I think, we hear the term and we sort of know what it means. We know that enrollment has declined not only for this board, but really around the province. Even when we look at some of the GTA boards and growth boards, I mean, there's been an impact. So I think it's important to understand what's been happening in terms of demographics, what's been happening not only over the last decade, but really over the last 30, 40, 50 years that's put us in the situation that we are now. So that's why I think it's important to talk a little bit about what's been happening nationally, what's been happening provincially as well. So if anyone's seen my presentations on enrollment projections before, I typically, and I've done this for years, and until it becomes irrelevant, I think I'm going to continue doing it. I start out with a really quick chart that just looks at some historical births and historical fertility rates. And I think this chart, I mean, almost, in absence of the rest of my presentation, this little chart with a couple of lines really starts to tell the story of why we're in this environment of declining enrollment over the last decade, 15 years or so. When we look at this chart, what it shows is it shows the number of total births, so that's the purple jagged line, and then the total fertility rate is the black solid line from the 1920s all the way to the 2000s. And we can see post-World War II, and probably not a shock to anybody, the baby boom generation exists because of post-World War II. Things were good, wars were over, society thought, here we go into this sort of new bold world, and people started having babies like crazy. And that's resulted in the baby boom generation. And we see that huge spike in births post-World War II. We see that huge spike in fertility rate as well. And that's really what's produced this population bulge today that we know as the baby boom generation. When we look, though, at what happened after that sort of 20 years, 30 years after World War II, we see a really big drop, not only in the number of births, but really more importantly in the total fertility rate, because that's really what's telling us the future of school-age children, the future of household size. And what we see is that drastic drop starting about the 70s. And we say, okay, so what happened? We were all having all these babies post-World War II. Things were really great. What happened in the 1970s that sort of, caused this impact to enrollment projections today? I can do a whole presentation on exactly what happened in the 1970s, but there's a couple of major things that really started to impact why women in general started having less children around that time. So one important thing, if we think back to the 1970s, women started going to school in way greater numbers. Women started entering the workforce in way greater numbers. So as that started to happen, obviously you weren't having 4 or 5 or 6 kids. As that started to happen, families were having 3 or 4 kids. And as that continued to perpetuate, families in general just became smaller. So that was a big contributor to smaller household sizes, smaller families in general. Couple of other things that happened in the 1970s. I mean, we can look back and say legalized abortion was definitely something that started to bring down the number of births and the number of children in the 1970s. Another major thing that happened in the 70s, there was a huge energy crisis. So in general, because of that energy crisis, things became a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact. And all of these sort of happened in and around the same time, had a pretty big impact on birth rates. And that's why we sort of see that big bulge. and that big drop. So First World War II, population increased, as we talked about. Rapid, significant infrastructure increase to adapt to that population increase. That includes a lot of schools being built during that time. So a lot of schools that exist today were really built and according to population sizes and settlement patterns from about 50 or 60 years ago. So that's why when we talk about decline in enrollment, we talk about utilization rates, we talk about places growing differently than they have today compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago. A lot of it is because of this and these changing household sizes, changing settlement patterns as well. So when we look at, fast forward and we look at some of the more recent population trends and what that impact has had on sort of the last 10 or 15 years, it's important to look at some of the things happening nationally. And one of the first things I'll talk about nationally is the overall population, because a lot of times in a school board world, I do presentations to school boards, and either from the board itself or anecdotally from the community I hear, there's a lot of growth going on in my neighborhood. Why are we not seeing increases in enrollment? And from a school board perspective, we have to be very careful about when we talk about growth, because the first question I ask when I hear about growth is I say, where is the growth occurring? What kind of growth? What kind of houses are being built? Who is it being marketed towards? Because all growth does not equal growth for a school board. All growth does not mean there's going to be increases in school-age children. And when we look at the national picture, it's quite telling. Canada, when we look at the G7 nations, so those are Canada, US, Italy, Germany, few of the European nations, Japan. So basically what's known as sort of the first world trading nations. And when we look at populations of those nations, Canada's number one in terms of population growth over the last 10 or 15 years. So when we look at our overall population, we're growing. Between 2001, 2011, we grew by about 12%. Between 11 and 16, started to slow a little bit, but we're still growing by over 1% per year, which is a pretty decent population growth for a first world nation, first world country. One really important thing to take into context, or when we talk about population growth in Canada, that about 2/3, and this is increasing, but 2/3 of our population growth is reliant on international immigration. So natural increase, natural increase rate in developing nations, typically around 2.1, so meaning we have to have 2.1 children just to replace the population that exists. If you look back at that fertility rate chart, I think Canada was around 1.5, 1.6. So I mean, based on natural increase alone, we can't even replace the population we have. So to continue growing, we're reliant. It's going to be in about 10, 15, 20 years, almost 90 to 100% reliant upon international migration for Canada to keep growing. And this last point, when we talk about, Canada's growing, but why aren't we seeing sort of that relationship to school-age children and births? For the first time in Canada, there are more seniors than children living in Canada. So it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It all relates to that baby boom slide. Canada's growing. We're still seeing that population bulge move through. People are living longer, all of these good things, but that's not necessarily relating to school-age children. The growth that we're seeing in Canada is largely that 50-plus population growth right now. And over that time, while a lot of good things for Canada and national population growth, over that same time, or at least between 01 and 11, while Canada grew by about 12%, the 4 to 13-year-old population, so the elementary age population, declined by about 7% over that same period. So there's not that relationship, right? That just because we see total population growth, it's going to equate to school age growth as well. So in Ontario, what's been happening? So very similar things. So in Ontario, just before we get into some of the stats, it's really what's been driving Canadian population growth over at least the last 50 years, definitely over the last 20, 25 years. But as we see in a couple of seconds, that's starting to change a little bit as well. So from 01 to 06, Ontario grew by about 6.5%, so 750,000 people. That was 50% of all Canada population growth during the early 2000s. But as we move through 2006 to 2011, Ontario continues to grow at a pretty good rate, but a little bit less than 6% this time. Also important to note, because we just talked about the importance of migration in terms of population growth, the number of migrants into Ontario dropped by about 100,000 compared to 01 to 06. So we see that relationship, right? We see that Ontario is starting to grow a little bit less. Why? Because we're not seeing the same number of international migrants than we've seen historically. And when we fast forward to the last census period, 11 to 16, again, Ontario keeps growing, but that rate is continuing to drop when we compare it to historically. And again, migration continues to drop. And what's happening? Canada is still seeing the numbers pretty much of the international migration coming into Canada. But what's happening is Canada's starting to diversify, for lack of a better term. And I don't mean, ethnicity-wise or culturally, but Canada's starting to diversify from an employment perspective as well. So where majority of international migrants coming into Canada typically were the big three cities, right? Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto. We're really starting to see that change now, and migrants are starting to spread out throughout a lot of other parts of Canada. Even we're not seeing it in this census, but I would venture and say in the next 2021 census, we're going to start seeing Eastern Canada starting to pick up some of that international migration as well. So again, good things from a national perspective, but when we start bringing it down to, what we care about and where we live, not so good for Ontario. Again, important to note that we're still growing just a little bit less than we have been historically. So when we look at Ontario, and we talked a little bit about what's happening nationally, population versus school-aged children populations. In Ontario, we see some pretty drastic things that have happened, and we'll go back to 2001. It's the same story that we talked about nationally, but just looking at these numbers really paints the picture in terms of where we are today. So if you look at for simplicity's sake, yellow on this chart is bad and blue is good. So if we look back to 96, 2001, so I started doing this in just around the end of 1998. So I came in, fairly fresh out of school, didn't know a lot about demographics yet. I had heard about David Foote, who had just started writing about population decline, school-age children decline, I think in 97, 98, around there. But demographically speaking, and I had started at Watson at this time, demographically speaking, I don't think we had really understood what the impact of this 52,600 decline in 0 to 3 population. I mean, we definitely noticed it and we definitely talked about it, and we were definitely, I was a fresh-faced kid at the time, so I didn't know too much about it, but I mean, it was evident, but we didn't think that it was going to have as much of an impact that it actually ended up having. And it's hard to think about this major decline when you're in a position where the elementary population has increased almost 60,000 after years of increases. Secondary population has almost increased 75,000. So I think part of it was just hard to wrap your head around this kind of decline coming. Sitting here 20 years later, I think back and go, how did I not see, how did no one, and not people did see it, but like I said, not to the extent that it happened. Partly because we've probably thought there's going to be migration, there's going to be young families that keep coming in that are going to supplant some of this decline. But the decline was of such magnitude that, and like I said, as we see some of those migration numbers starting to fall, it was sort of this perfect storm of enrollment decline happening. And we see quite clearly as the numbers start to feed out, we see that 0 to 3 become, in a decade, it became almost a 90,000 decline in the elementary age population. Some positive things that we're seeing, we did see an increase in the 0 to 3 population between 06 and 01 of about over 25,000. However, a little bit surprisingly from a demographic perspective, we saw that fall again in 11 to 16. And when we look at births in a couple of minutes, we're just not seeing that uptick that, based on that increase of 0 to 3 in 2006 to 2011, demographically speaking, we would have expected to see that kind of keep pushing through. We're really not seeing it. And again, going back to some of the things I talked about earlier, probably relates a little bit to just those Ontario numbers not being as robust as they were 10 or 15 years ago. This is just a quick graphical representation of that chart. So we really just get a chance to see, that quick 0 to 3 drop between 96, 2001, Post 2001, we see it impacting the elementary population. And now we're in an environment where it's starting to impact secondary. As elementary starts to stabilize, we think we've sort of been through the worst of it. But all of those declines that we saw historically over the last 10, 15 years in elementary, those are going to start to impact secondary, and they already are. As you see, 20 years of increase, and 11 to 16, we're starting to see that impact of the elementary decline hitting the 14 to 18-year-old population as well. So when we look at births, so there were, as we talked about, some very sharp declines in births throughout the 1990s. We'll see in a second that they really hit the bottom of the trough in 2000. Started to stabilize a little bit in the early 2000s, then climbed back up again. But we'll look at what I was talking about. So you can see from the early 1990s, you see that really drastic drop going down through the 90s up to the early 2000s. Early 2000s, we see that those births start to come back up again, reflected in what we looked at in the 0 to 3 and elementary stabilization now. But it's sort of in here that from 11 to 14, we were expecting, so we saw an increase from basically 2010, 2011, 2012, and then post 2012, we're just seeing a lot of stability. You've seen, a couple of years going down, then going back up again, then down a little bit, then up a little bit, and then I think it goes down a little bit, and then down again in 2018. So again, I'm very cautious about the next sort of 5 or 10 years. Like I said, we really would have expected, I think, to see a little bit more growth, a little bit more of an increase in the births, and that stability is making us just a little bit cautious. And it goes back to when I looked at the 0 to 3 population in 2016, and like I said, I would have expected it to at least be stable compared to the previous 5 years, if not some increases. And that drop that we saw was a little bit alarming. It caused me to be a little bit cautious back in 2016, and the births over the last few years seems to be bearing that out. So the 2021 census is going to be very telling. We're still a couple of years away from it, but it's going to be telling in the sense that, are we still seeing this kind of trend, or are we having trouble pushing back up, or are we going to start to see some changes? So we've talked about the national perspective. We brought it down to understand what's happening in Ontario as well, and a few slight differences provincially compared to nationally, and we think that's having a little bit of an impact. Obviously, we talked about births, and we're not seeing those numbers come up. So now we want to bring it down to your board's jurisdiction and see how the demographics here compared to what we talked about provincially and nationally. So, I can tell you that you weren't in a vacuum, and that Avon-Maitland District School Board was definitely impacted by a lot of those declines that we saw both nationally and provincially. Some nice things that are happening on the 0 to 3 population, decline between 01 and 06, similar to what we saw in other areas. Some stability between 2006 and 2011. So again, provincially, we saw quite a bit of an increase in the 0 to 3. Here, some stability. But whereas in Ontario, we saw that drop in the 0 to 3 population between 11 and 16, here we actually saw just under a 7% increase. So again, some positive signs in terms of what we expect for elementary school age children going forward. One thing I want to note, though, is even though we've seen sort of that 7% increase in that last census period, it's important to note that we're really just back to where we were in 2001. And a lot of the projection work that I've been doing lately, a little bit cheeky, but I call them my happy face projections, because really what they're doing is they're declining, but they're starting to come back up again. But really, when we look at those increases over the next 5 or 10 years, they've really just come back to where we were about 5, 6 years ago. So really good that we're starting to, like I said, see that bottom of the trough coming up through it. But again, it's important for everyone in this room to realize that really that those increases, if we hit them, are really just putting us back to where we were several years ago. So that's what's going on with 0 to 3. Again, when we look at the 4 to 13 elementary population, some very significant declines over the last decade or so. And when we look at historical enrollment, probably not a surprise to anybody in this room that demographically these kind of things were going on. But double-digit declines between 01 and 06, almost 11%, still 8% in the middle of the census periods. However, again, as we're seeing sort of that 0 to 3 population come up, the last census period is showing us that elementary population is starting to stabilize a little bit. So we actually saw slight increase, only 25, about 0.2%, but better than the historical declines that we've seen. And then secondary, again, not much of a surprise, pretty stable in the early 2000s, starting to get hit by some of that elementary decline, about 7.5%, 06 to 11, and then really starting to get hit in the last census period, about 10%. 21 census comes out. The reality is we're probably going to see continued declines in that secondary population. So we've gone through and we've talked about demographics, and we talked about the impact of births and preschool age children and all those different factors and how they start to really dictate what enrollment's going to do. The next couple of slides I want to look at just focus a little bit more on your actual enrollment. So we'll look a little bit at your historical enrollment patterns, look a little bit at what your junior kindergarten grade has done, because obviously that's a big driver of what your future projections are going to look like. Look a little bit at a term I call grade structure ratio, which really just looks at your senior grades compared to your entry level grades, because again, that's very telling in the absence of anything else. I mean, if you have, for simplicity's sake, 10 JKs coming into a school and 30 grade 8s leaving, you're going to have enrollment decline as that feeds through the system. So that's an important one to look at. And then we'll talk briefly about enrollment share. Again, enrollment share is a topic that I can talk about for days, so I don't want to dwell on it too much. But I do want to talk about just the sort of uniqueness of Ontario and sort of the wild card that enrollment share has on enrollment projections. So when we look at what's been happening historically with your board, like we said, we looked at the demographics, so it shouldn't be much of a surprise that when we looked at the declines in elementary school age children, that's going to have a significant impact on enrollment. So we go back to 2001-02, enrollment elementary was around 13,152. By the time we get to 2016-17, just a little bit over 10,000. So really significant declines, about over 25% decline in enrollment over that 16-year period. And like I said, when we compare it to what happened to the elementary school age children in the jurisdiction, not a surprise that enrollment would also go down. When we look at the JK grade, we see that actually over that time, JK's actually increased a little bit from around 923 to 973, but between 2011 and 2016, a pretty good decline in the JK grade from about 973 to 880. So obviously that's going to impact what we've seen in the last several years as that starts to feed through the system as well. The other thing I wanted to point out here was what I talked about was grade structure ratio. So it's the very last line here, and you see it's 1.19, 1.25. So really what this number is looking at, like I said, it's looking at the numbers of grade 6, 7, and 8s in your system as a whole compared to the JK, SK, and 1. So it's a ratio that looks at the senior to entry level grades. So if your junior level grades or entry level grades were equal to your senior level grades, your grade structure ratio would be 1. Anything below 1 would indicate that your junior is bigger than your senior, so it should indicate some enrollment increase or stability. Anything larger than 1 is indicating that obviously your senior is larger than your element or your entry level. So when we're looking at something like 1.25, what's that saying? What that's saying is that you have 25% more students in your senior grades than you do in your entry level grades. So again, not probably a surprise that we see those kind of declines happening over the next several years as these larger cohorts, you can see 1250, 1240 start to leave the system, and they're being replaced by cohorts of around 1,000. So that's going to really dictate, especially in the short term, what your enrollment's going to do. When we look at what's been happening on the secondary panel, definitely some similarities. We see the grade 9 starting to decline. They were as high as about 1,600 in the early 2000s, just around 1,150, 1,200 when we look at 2016-17. Same thing, we see some periods of enrollment decline, not as significant in the early parts of the 2000s, but again, going back to what I was talking about, as that elementary decline has fed into secondary, we're starting to see it impact secondary enrollments as well. So 7%, 5% in the early to mid 2000s, declining about 13% between 2011 and 2016. The other thing I want to point out quickly is when we look at some of the decline between 01 and 06, while it's showing about 7%, let's keep in mind that this 2003 was the elimination of OAC, or fifth year, so that's going to have some impact on that enrollment decline. So secondary populations as a whole were still pretty stable during that time, so a lot of that early decline is contributing, or is being contributed to the elimination of OAC. So getting into enrollment share a little bit, we'll look at what's been going on with your board, but I just quickly wanted to show a few stats over the last couple of decades in terms of what's happening with enrollment share on a provincial basis. So we've just looked at some stats looking at, this is just between Catholic boards and public boards. So you can see that from looking at public board enrollment shares going back to 2001, around 67% when we look at elementary school age children, and public boards have been picking up share over that time, just a little bit under 69% when we look at 2015 numbers. And that's just the latest numbers that were available when we did this from the ministry. We are looking at updating those numbers as soon as we can, so we can provide some additional data to the board once that happens. Secondary has been a little bit of a different picture, where secondary, we were looking at rates in the public system of over 71%. That's declined to a little over 67% when we look back at 2015 numbers. When we look at what's been happening with your board, a little bit different. So whereas Ontario-wide public boards have been picking up a little bit of share, and when we look at your board going back to 2001 through to 2016, you've lost a little bit of share. So you're as high as 68% in 2001, dropped a little bit to 2006, 67%, then down to 66%, around 63% in 2016. I don't have secondary up there, but secondary has been a little bit more consistent. I don't have the rates off the top of my head. I think it's around 67%. Went up to 68% in 2011, came back down slightly to 67%. So you've kind of been hovering in, I think, that 67, 68% range on the secondary panel, and it's actually stayed fairly, like aside from that bump I mentioned, it's stayed fairly consistent over the last 10 or 15 years. So a little bit of a different pattern in Avon-Maitland than what we've been seeing overall provincially. The other thing we look at, so just quickly, when we talk about participation rate and board share, so when I'm talking about participation rate, that is looking at your board's enrollment relative to the total elementary aged population. So it's saying of all the 4 to 13-year-old children that are eligible to go to elementary school, some go to private schools, some go to French board schools, some go to Catholic schools, some are homeschooled. This is your percentage of that total population that attends Avon-Maitland District School Board elementary schools. Then when we talk about board share, in addition to looking at the enrollment or participation rate, we want to look at what's happening between the largest enrollment share, and that's the two, the English public board and the Catholic board, the two English language boards. And so we also look at what's happening in terms of share there historically. So right now, when we compare yourselves' enrollment to the Huron-Perth Catholic District School Board, on the elementary panel, you get about a 76% share, and that's remained somewhat stable. It's declining slightly, but it's remained, especially when we look at the last 2 or 3 years, there's some stability in overall enrollment share. Obviously, it changes when we look at geography and, you know, depending on where schools are located and different factors that we'll talk about in a second. But it's somewhat stable on the secondary panel, a little bit of a higher share than the elementary panel, just under 80%. So about a 79% share of enrollment between yourselves and your English coterminous board. And just quickly on enrollment share, only because it's a little bit unique in Ontario. And not every province has the variety of publicly funded school boards that Ontario has. So it makes projections, enrollment projections, it adds another dimension, a little bit of a wild card. It's not so much looking at what is the population doing, and the board has this share of the population. And in some places, I mean, if there's limited public options in terms of other school boards or other schools, if we look at other provinces, sometimes school boards have had, with the exception of some homeschooling and private schools, that usually doesn't move the needle as much. If they've gotten 90% of the population, they pretty much get that for 20, 30, 40 years and with no signs of changing. Like I said, because there aren't a lot of other options out there. In Ontario, that's the wild card that, like I said, is a little bit unique here, because we have private schools and homeschooling just like every other province, but we also have publicly funded Catholic boards, publicly funded French boards in both religions, or as Catholic and non-Catholic as well. So when we do projections, we have to not only look at all the demographics and all the historical enrollment and all these different factors we've talked about, but we also have to make some assumptions about what is enrollment share going to do. And to be perfectly honest and transparent, when I started doing this 20 years ago, it was a conversation that we really didn't have. Rates had not changed all that much as Catholic boards picked up share when Catholic boards were funded. When I started doing this in the late 90s, early 2000s, rates were fairly stable. And it was also, for lack of a better word, almost a taboo subject. When I would meet with school boards and talk about enrollment projections, share is something that we really didn't want to talk about. Wasn't a lot of data on it at the time, aside from the census data that we can look at. So it wasn't a huge part of my methodology in terms of enrollment projections. Now it's changing all the time, and especially when we talk about mid to smaller size boards, even 0.5%, a percent change in enrollment share can have a very significant impact on your longer term numbers. And when we start to break that down and start to talk about smaller communities or smaller schools for that matter, if you have a school of 100 or 200 with 10, 12, 13 JKs, we have to understand that it can be sometimes a personal decision, right? That sometimes we have situations where 4 or 5 JK students decide to go to the coterminous board or to a different school. That can have a huge impact on those projections, especially in a smaller school. If we're talking about half the JKs leaving in 1 year, obviously as that flows through the projection and flows through the system, that can have a pretty major impact. So projections, I think I touched upon earlier, maybe not. They're very fluid, right? We tend to think of projections, I give them to the board, and then we tend to think of them in this static way almost. Here's your projections, here's the Bible, like this is what everything is gonna be like for the next 2 or 3 years. The reality is nothing really works that way, and everything is fluid, and projections are really this living, breathing object that as things change, and your board has been great because you've done those constant updates and stayed on top of things. But some boards, do projections once every 5 years, and that's it. And there's a lot of things that change during that time that need to be updated. So, and share is a really big one, right? As much as we try to be very data heavy and very metrics heavy and a lot of relationships and cross checks to come up with a product that we think is defensible. But when we talk about share, it's really asking me as a demographer, as someone who does projections, try to get inside the mind of the way people choose. And as much as I think I know how to do that, and I hope I've gathered a little bit of techniques in terms of trying to make some assumptions in that. I mean, no one can really understand, how someone's going to think. Are we going to go into French immersion next year? Am I going to send my kid to this school? Are we going to try a different, those are things that we really can't pinpoint. Like I said, we try to do as much as we can using these historical relationships and data and metrics, but sometimes things just change. And oftentimes what I say to school board clients is, I'm not so much concerned that if my projection is off, I'm concerned when my projection is off and I can't explain it. I'm concerned that if my numbers are wrong and a lot of the things that I talk about happened and the numbers are still wrong, then we really have to go back and say, okay, we really need to drill down on what exactly happened here. But oftentimes I can go back historically and say, okay, sure, my projection is off there. The municipality said that there was going to be 500 units built, marketed towards single family, and that subdivision never happened. Or that subdivision ended up getting occupied by the 50 plus population. No kids came out of it. That's fine, and I want school boards to, and trustees in the community to understand that. As long as we can sort of draw that direct line back and say, okay, what is the situation? Why didn't this happen? That's okay. I mean, really projections are trying to make us aware of situations and helping us monitor situations. We see that this projection is showing this school is supposed to increase by 15%. Why? Big development is expected to occur in it. So we could look and we can monitor, and we know that something may be happening there. And as houses keep getting built, then we can say, okay, it looks like things are happening. We can expect to see enrollment, or vice versa. Houses aren't getting built, delay in a subdivision. We can say, okay, that's still on our radar screens, but we know that those numbers are probably not going to happen for a couple of years. Going back to enrollment share, and like I said, trying to get into the heads of the way people think, there's some very obvious impacts to enrollment share. Obviously, religion and religious requirements are going to have an impact on what board or what school children can attend. Language, when we talk about French school boards, are obviously going to have an impact. So those are two things that we can look at. We have data on religion. We have data on language. Those are things that we can attempt to quantify a little bit better. But the things that I was just talking about that are a little bit more difficult to quantify are when we get into, where is the school? Where is it in relation to where I live? Do I need to get bused there? Is this convenient for me as a family? What kind of programs are being offered? And this is becoming increasingly a factor that's going to impact enrollment share, because parents today are definitely more proactive in terms of looking at the school and looking at the program and looking at the board. I mean, I know when I was a kid, and probably everybody else in this room, I just went to the school that I was supposed to go to in terms of where I lived, and I went to the secondary school that my elementary school fed into, and I never remember a discussion about program or sports teams or anything like that, and I never remember my parents talking about that. Today it's much different, so those are obviously factors. And then, like I said, private schools have some impact. There's definitely more of them now compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago. Religious private schools, especially in your board's jurisdiction, are starting to have more of an impact that we need to look at. Facility condition, when we talk about proactive parents, it's not only the program or the location, but also the condition of the actual facility kids are being sent to. So all of these definitely have a bigger impact today on projections than they have had historically. Oops. Sorry. So getting into exactly what's going on, what all this means, and how this shakes out and relates to what we projected for your board. So when we look at some of the quick historical numbers, so in 1819, the board's enrollment was about 10,000, elementary enrollment was about 10,194, so just shy of 10,200. Increased a little bit by about 50 kids between 18 and 19, so your current October enrollments are about 10,244. Over the next several years, we expect over the next 5 years, enrollments to stay on a board-wide basis, fairly stable. Again, some slight increases going up to about 10,311, so about another 50 increase over the next 5 years. And again, going back to what I was talking about, we were looking at that grade structure ratio, still over 1. There's still some larger senior cohorts, as we see, starting to move out of the system, being replaced by slightly smaller numbers, and we'll get some stability once we move into year 5 in terms of how that cohort or grade structure looks. And then we see a little bit of a more robust increase in that year, between that year 5 to 10 projection, going up to about 10,000, just shy of 10,700. On the secondary panel, a little bit different. So between 18 and 19, we've seen a bit of a decline in your secondary enrollment. Some of that expected based on the factors that we discussed earlier in terms of demographics, elementary decline feeding into the secondary enrollments as well. But that 1920 number is a little bit under even what we expected it to be, and a lot of that just relates to the Stratford situation. There was a decline in enrollment at the Stratford schools as the board was working out what to do with their Stratford 7 and 8 and Stratford Secondary School. In conversations with staff, our feeling, our assumption is that is a temporary blip. Students will be coming back once the new schools are combined and open again. So we do see the enrollment starting to come back up from that. So even that 5208 to 5630, it's a little bit of a more pronounced increase than if you didn't have that sort of decline or that issue in 2019-20. So if that didn't happen, I mean, if we look at 5502, what you had last year compared to 5630, you see a bit of a more stable decline. Really, that blip happened, dropped it down, and now we sort of have to work to get back up there a little bit again. You'll see that it starts to decline a little bit in the year 5 to 10, and again, that just relates back to everything we were talking about as elementary feeds into secondary. So just before, I promise I'm almost done talking, but just before we end up, I just wanted to talk quickly about a couple of things just to summarize. So when we talk about enrollment projections, we talked a lot about the demographics and the different factors that go into it. One thing that I didn't talk about was the residential or new future residential development that's going to impact your projections as well. So that again is going to help mitigate some of the demographic issues that we've talked about. And there's a couple of definite hot spots. I mean, Listowel definitely comes to mind, and I'm sure everyone's aware that that's been growing quite a bit over the last several years. And again, in conversations with planning departments in the county and in the municipality, there seems to be no end in sight, so we expect growth to continue there. And it's definitely attracting, it's affordable units, attracting young families, and we're definitely seeing some correlated increases in your enrollment there as well. Stratford continues to see some development. The thing with Stratford is price point. I mean, it's a little bit more expensive compared to other parts of the county. Definitely attracting not so much of like Listowel that I said, is definitely attracting it seems like a younger family complement. Stratford still attracts sort of that over 50 plus. So while we're seeing younger families starting to move into the area and the surrounding area, a lot of the development still attracts that 50 plus population as well. So it's going to sort of mitigate some of those increases we might expect to see. And it goes back to what I was talking about. Yes, we're definitely seeing growth starting to happen in Stratford. We're seeing units built. Are they going to completely translate into school-age children? Some of them, but not all of them. And just quickly, Hugh mentioned at the beginning, Watson not only works with school boards, but a large part of our company works with municipalities throughout Ontario. We do a lot of growth forecast work, growth management studies, development charges. We work a lot in the county, in the counties in your jurisdiction, as well as local municipalities. So it really, from an enrollment projection point of view, it gives me a head up. I mean, because historically, when I had my own company, this was stuff that I would do on my own or that I would subcontract out. Now having the backing of, honestly, one of the province's leading demographic companies to back up what we're doing from a... So I was really just going to finish off. So really just talking about, as part of this projection process, we were in touch with both counties. We were in touch with a lot of the local municipalities. We actually completed some of the development charges that went into the residential forecast for those reports. So just rest assured, is really all I'm trying to say, is that we've done our due diligence with regard to the residential portion of these projections as well. So just to finish off, really quickly, you have all this information. I'm not going to go school by school, but the last couple of sheets that you have just outline the enrollment projections on a school-by-school basis. And really the only thing I wanted to point out by showing those last couple of slides was just the differences. I mean, we see that on an overall basis, what we talked about, elementary is increasing a little bit, secondary looks like it's still coming back up, but you can really start to see the variance on a board basis. Some schools are increasing, like we talked about, Listowel increasing by, I think about, oh, look, it came back, increasing by about 200. And then we have a few schools that are around 100, some in the 50 range. And then we have a bunch of schools that are staying stable. And then if we move to the next slide, we can see that we have some schools that are in decline. So, from the top school in Listowel, we're about a 200 pupil expected increase over the next 10 years. And then we look at the bottom range where schools like Howick down about 60 kids, Clinton down about 80 or 90 kids. So it does vary quite a bit throughout the board's jurisdiction when we look at it on a school-by-school basis. Some similar things going on the secondary panel as well. Surprise, surprise, Listowel increasing by about 125 students over the next 10 years, South Huron by about 75, some stability in a few schools, and then when we look down, Maddle down a little bit, and Stratford down about 139. But again, keeping in mind that some of that was due to the last year or so of those changes at Stratford. So just to finish off, in summary, we talked a little bit about the national and provincial populations. Really the main point that I want us to take away from that is that total population growth doesn't necessarily equate to school age population growth. One nice thing demographically is we're starting to see some stability in the preschool and elementary school populations. Like I said earlier, the numbers that we look at suggest that we're sort of past the worst of it. I'm a little bit more cautious, I think, than I was even 5 years ago in terms of what we're expecting to see going forward, but I don't expect us to go back to where we were 5 or 10 years ago. And then just to quickly finish off, like I said, it's really the issues that we've dealt with on the elementary panel now sort of seem to be at the forefront of the secondary panel. So that's important as administrators, trustees, senior staff, that we sort of put our attention there over the next couple of years. And that concludes my presentation. I hope I didn't go too long, and I'm happy to take any questions.